We're here today to discuss eating disorders and the Jewish community. I had no idea the impacts of an eating disorder on the Jewish community, holidays, dating, and marriage. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Eileen Fishman, and I'm here today with Sandra Kronberg and Sarah Rohr, and we'll just tell you a bit about ourselves. Also, I want to thank NEDA and the Orthodox Union because they have joined together to have us here and to try to help educate and support the community. So I've been treating eating disorders, specializing in eating disorders for the last 30 years in private practice in Manhattan and also in Montclair, New Jersey. Sandra?
I too have been treating eating disorders for the past 30 years. I run an outpatient treatment center, Eating Disorder Treatment Collaborative, and I'm on the advisory board of Montenegro and affiliates.
I'm Dr. Sarah Rohr. I'm a psychologist practicing on the Upper West Side and been involved in eating disorders and specializing in eating disorders in the last 5 or 6 plus years.
Okay. So hopefully we're going to be covering a lot of questions and ideas today. So first of all, to start with an overview of eating disorders, Sandra.
So eating disorders are often thought about as food-related disorders, and so I wanted to clarify that a little bit. It's not so much about the food, but how one thinks and feels about food and how that gets demonstrated. There's an emotional part to an eating disorder, a behavioral part to an eating disorder, and a physiological and genetic piece that come together in these multifaceted behavioral, emotional, and physical disorders, which make them very complex to both diagnose and treat. If we wanted to at least assign some qualities, anorexia is about not being able to take things in. It's about not feeling good about oneself. It's about saying no instead of being able to take things in, and it actually gets to the point where it's life-threatening. It's one of the psychological illnesses that has the highest mortality rate. If we move a little bit further on the continuum of eating disorders to bulimia tends to happen in a more impulsive personality, and it's about taking things in and then feeling guilty and shameful about it and having to compensate and get rid of it. So that might be in the form of purging or some other way of compensation. And moving further along the continuum to binge eating disorder, which was formerly called compulsive overeating, is about really an internal feeling of not getting enough, but how that manifests in terms of food is that there's a sense of needing to fill up an empty hole, and once one does that, there's a sense of guilt and shame about that, and a cycle of feeling bad about oneself. All of these emotional and behavioral signs and symptoms lead to a sense of I don't like myself, I don't feel good about myself, and I'm not okay. And often the extremeness leads to death and fatality.
Eating disorders do have the highest mortality rate of all mental disorders. And 30 million people suffer from eating disorders sometime throughout their lifetime. So this is a very, very prevalent disorder. And it's very important that we start talking about it in general and that we're talking about it in the Jewish community and the Orthodox community, because a lot of people have been suffering in silence for a long time. There are very serious health consequences. Some health consequences, like Sandra mentioned, even mortality is possible, particularly with anorexia nervosa, but even with bulimia nervosa. So there can be very, very serious consequences medically. A lot of the medical consequences are reversible, though, so that's where treatment comes in, and we'll be talking about treatment. You'll be hearing about that from all of us on the panel and as we're speaking. But the medical consequences are very real. Again, these disorders are very, very serious. And these disorders impact people, every aspect of people's lives, because they become increasingly preoccupying. So people who start out on a diet or start out, they lose weight, they look great, they get a lot of feedback from people in their lives about how wonderful they look. And meanwhile, that sort of supports it, it goes on, but people are getting sicker and sicker. As they get thinner and thinner, they get more and more preoccupied. They're thinking about food, they're thinking about their weight, they're thinking about how much they're eating, how much they're not eating, and it impacts every aspect of their life, increasingly, their relationships, their professional lives, all of their lives. So these are very, very serious, complex disorders. So I wanted to ask Sarah, do you think eating disorders are happening within the Jewish community at the same rate as they are within the general population? And what do you think the statistics are for the Jewish community and general public?
You know, I think that there's been a lot of recent discussion about the Orthodox Jewish community and the Jewish community in general in terms of understanding its place in the eating disorder community. And I think one of the things that is fascinating is that when we look from a historical perspective at the relationship between religion in general and eating disorders, one of the more wonderful things is that there's a lot of wonderful research, both anecdotally and empirically, to support the fact that religion is actually a protective mechanism for eating disorders and for a lot of mental health illnesses in general. That being said, one of the things that's become more on the table for discussion is we're hearing more anecdotally that there is a rise or perhaps an awareness of eating disorders influencing and impacting the Orthodox community no different than the non-Orthodox community. And in fact, when there was a large study done by Sarah Weinberger-Littman, they looked at around 300 plus young women who were freshman age years and cross-compared them. What they found was that there was no statistical difference between the incidence rates of eating disorders in the Orthodox community and the non-Orthodox community. But what that also means is that there are a significant number of people suffering that perhaps are not feeling comfortable and being able to engage and get the support that they need and the treatment that they need. I think it also speaks to asking a question as to what has happened in the dialogue around religion, where religion used to be a protective factor and perhaps still is for many people. But where we're up to today in terms of how people are taking in or not taking in religion and how that's impacting their overall mental health and well-being. And I think it's a topic for future discussion and a lot of interesting research and discussion about how people relate to religion in terms of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. In other words, how much they're connected to that religion or how much is about fitting into a society. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating research. It's fascinating when you hear people talk about it in live work in terms of what's affecting them. But I think these are big issues when it comes to religion and specifically Judaism and eating disorders.
I think it's important, Sarah, about how it's not necessarily that there are more eating disorders in the Jewish community or in the Orthodox community. And I think that's what people have been talking about more recently. But in fact, it's just that we're talking about it. People are starting to be more outspoken about it, so we're more aware of it. Not that there's necessarily more greater incidence in the Jewish population.
Right, and I think that sometimes because there's been more dialogue around it, sometimes you hear people panicking. What's causing this in the Orthodox community that never was before? And I think it's not that it never was before. I think the incidence rates are the same, but I think it's about how we're talking about it. And so I think we always take in cultural sensitivity in terms of where a person's at in terms of treatment, but I think that those root causes that you spoke about some earlier in terms of where eating disorders come from, for most people are very much the same, but religion's a piece of it for people.
I also think the willingness for the community and the elders of the community to be willing to bring this out from under the covers so that those that are suffering from it can get help and to take away the feelings of shame that come along with mental illness or getting help. And what are the consequences of that? I think we'll talk about more in the Orthodox Jewish community in terms of, moving on in the life spectrum.
Yeah. And potentially secondary gains that come from eating disorders in the Jewish community in terms of ideal superwomen and women taking on a lot of responsibilities in the Jewish community, that there are other aspects that add to the complexity that on some level service the community as well, even though nobody maybe wants to talk about all those secondary gains that people may have.
It's about talking about all those things that are impacting the culture as a whole and how some of them get manifested and expressed through the eating disorder and not talked about. So we're all on the same page.
So, Sandra, what are the contributing factors to developing an eating disorder? some of the contributing factors, because we know there are many.
Well, I think we first need to come to the idea that at this point in time in the history and understanding of eating disorder, we understand that there is a strong genetic potential to the development of an eating disorder, that not everybody that experiences a diet or the pressure to lose weight or the cultural media or the societal, what it means to go through a shidduch and, develops an eating disorder. So we know that if somebody is genetically predisposed to be more anxious, more perfectionistic, more rigid, perhaps depressed, perhaps having some kind of OCD, that genetically predisposes them to the development of an eating disorder. If perfectionism is part of a genetic makeup, and I have the genetic predisposition to have obsessionality, anxiety, perfectionism, low self-esteem, then I am in this culture that deems that I be a certain size and weight to be okay. I'm vulnerable to the development of an eating disorder. So I think that is a huge criteria. The other criteria, I think, in nurture, that's the nature part of it. But the environment is part of it. What value we hold on being a certain size and weight, as opposed to, the uniqueness of each human being, is a predisposing factor. Those are two very important risk factors in the development of an eating disorder.
And Sarah, are there unique factors for Orthodox Jewish communities?
Well, I'm going to pick up on what you just said in terms of this idea of having to fit in, and I think that one of the things that Orthodoxy struggles with is giving people creative freedom, and at the same time wanting people to fit a mold and look the same way and act the same way and dress the same way. And so I think sometimes when we think about religion, we think about vulnerabilities. What if you don't fit in? What if you don't fit that mold and you're being asked to fit into that mold? That could even mean dress, in terms of the rigidity of the dress code. We all embrace our bodies and find things that work for us, but when you are restricted to a certain type of dress, I think there are different, you hear girls talking about the fact that they feel like they can't express themselves and they have to fit in a certain way. And the same thing for, this idea of matched marriages. So much of attraction is getting to know somebody. And if you're pre-screened and have to fit certain criteria, that can feel very overwhelming. So again, thinking about this idea that not every person who goes through that process is going to have an eating disorder, but somebody with more vulnerabilities and feeling like they have to fit into a mold and they are not as comfortable with their own creativity or their own sense of self or own sense of identity, I think becomes more complex. I like to think of it as Shel Silverstein's a missing piece. The missing piece only has one shape that can fit in. And what if we are not all one shape, and we're not all supposed to fit into that one shape, and what if everybody has to? And I think in Orthodoxy and religion, having people fit into that one shape becomes more complicated.
And just to elaborate, historically in the field, we used to talk about eating disorders as a voice. When you couldn't find a voice as a depressed expression of who you are, the eating disorder became a way of expressing things that were either too painful or too hard to express. So as you say that, there are many ways in which the culture says you need to think and say and be and dress a certain way, and there is enormous room in the culture for creativity, but sometimes that gets shifted aside and it feels like there's nowhere to go, and so the eating disorder becomes something of ownership and something that you can control and something that nobody else can take away from you, and it's a way of having a voice and having power. All of those sort of things fuel it.
I couldn't agree more, and I also think one of the other pieces thinking about religion and how it fuels it is that there's so many wonderful aspects of religion. I actually like to think about the fact that in Judaism, food is celebrated. We use it as in so many ways in symbolism. It's actually interesting to know that in the Middle Eastern cultures, they have a lower rate of eating disorders in Israel. If you look at the Middle Eastern, like more of the Sephardic tradition, and some of that has to do with celebration of food. People come together, it's family, and I think that with anything, if you take it to the extreme, and you use it, it has the potential to be used in a very maladaptive way and to be cultivated as an alternative voice that can lend itself towards in an unhealthy direction. So you think about the idea of, someone said to me that on the Sabbath you're supposed to have special foods. And so somebody said, or things that are special. Someone said that they decided that they're only drinking, someone shared with me they only drink black coffee during the week, and that on the Sabbath they put in milk and sugar. But when you think about it, it's this idea of really repressing and a little punishing, right? I have to punish myself during the week. It sets up a little bit of a restriction binge pattern, and doing it on the notion of religion. So using religion in a way that it wasn't intended to be per se, but somebody using their own background or their own vulnerabilities, whether it's obsessive, whether it's eating disorder, and their own thinking process, and using religion as a basis for manifesting it.
All people who have eating disorders struggle with low self-esteem. That's when people ask me, so what's the bottom line of an eating disorder? I'll say the bottom line of an eating disorder is low self-esteem. And, in terms of religion and in the Jewish community, sometimes people can start to try to use, they're trying to make themselves feel better about themselves. So anybody who's suffering, whether they're trying to change their body, or they're trying to have more self-control, or they're trying to be more religious and better at whatever it is, name it, better at everything, there's always the struggle. The challenge is, the bottom line is, they're trying to feel good about themselves and better about themselves. And sometimes the positive things in Judaism can then get misused and almost abused in a way to be self-restrictive, to be self-punishing. But again, the attempt is to feel better about oneself, more pious, more to gain
righteous.
Some esteem,
and
more
things
righteous.
Get very rigid and very perfectionistic, and that things get very, very narrow. So what becomes acceptable gets very, very small, and the challenge gets bigger to be more restrictive, more on top of, more better at that.
So the prognosis for eating disorders, people can get better. NEDA believes in being hopeful, and we know that with proper treatment, people get better. It can be a long process, and longer than most people want it to be, and longer than we as treatment professionals want it to be. Eating disorders don't start at the point that the eating disorder begins. Eating disorders, actually, the seeds are planted earlier. Genetically, they're planted. Society-wise, they're planted, and emotionally, psychologically, they're planted. So by the time the eating disorder comes out, and then by the time treatment is gotten and gets underway, and it takes time, and but people get better, and we want to really give a message for that and why treatment is so important. We know the longer an eating disorder goes untreated, the harder it is to treat. We know that treatment is not only helpful, it works, it's important to do it sooner rather than later. It's very, very important, and we'll be talking more about this as we go, that we help educate and support families to be able to take care of their loved ones, to understand eating disorders, because they're very confusing. They feel almost unnatural. What do you mean you don't want to eat? What do you mean you don't see how thin you are? What do you mean you're throwing up your food? All of that is just, we can't understand it. So trying to help families to understand these disorders and to understand how important their roles are in trying to help their loved one. So it's not just sending your child away who has an eating disorder or your spouse away who has an eating disorder. It's you getting involved also in the treatment and the care so that you can help support recovery and also ongoing stability and health. So a question of stigma, I think, is important. How does stigma of eating disorders in the Orthodox Jewish community and mental health issues more generally impact those who struggle or have family members who struggle? And we know that stigma is a huge issue in general for people with mental health, in general with eating disorders, and certainly in the Jewish community and the Orthodox community. And Sarah, I wanted you to please speak more about that.
I might be in an unpopular camp. Sometimes I think we want to make things so different in the Orthodox community than they are in other communities. And so we work hard to try to think about different cultural ways that they must be different. And You know what? I think as a society, we are struggling, and hopefully we're making good movement towards taking away the stigma for all mental health, including eating disorders, in order to really allow people to not only seek treatment, but also to allow people to feel a sense of hope and recovery and movement in their life in general. So do I think that's basically the same in the Orthodox community. One of the things I think that's different about the Orthodox community, that being said,
Okay.
now we're bracing for it, is, again, it's such a matchmaker system
Yeah.
that we're doing so much pre-screening. So when you get to know somebody, and as people share more about themselves, you're able to take in information about a person's life in the context of who they are. But in Orthodox communities where it's set up, you don't get that opportunity. It's basically pre-screened, and then you've either moved on to the next segment or been discarded based on very clear information. And one of those pieces of information becomes mental health. And unfortunately, you hear about horrible stories of people who go off antidepressant medication so they can say that they're not suffering from depression. People who, really go to great lengths and then ultimately do themselves and everybody a disservice in terms of trying to hide the matchmaking piece. I think that's one huge piece of it. I think the other piece is the genetic piece. There becomes a genetic label. And I think in a religion where children is celebrated and rejoiced, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing and such an important thing, I think people get caught up on genetic perfectionism. When you think about this idea, we do pre-screening for different genetic diseases that exist. And I think that there's this idea or fantasy that somehow we can make perfect children without any issues. And we just want to somehow kind of have children who live in cocoons that we can guarantee that they'll never suffer. Who will be perfect, exactly. And I think any person who's a parent can embrace the fact that our children are not, we don't love our children because they're perfect. We love our children because they're imperfect, and we are imperfect, and we as parents are raising complex children in complicated worlds. But I do think that that's a piece of it.
And yet it's a very big part of, all of my young girls are in this system, and there's a very huge pressure on them, about their eating disorder, about disclosing their eating disorder, about being matched at a higher or lower level because of their predisposition or because of their manifestation.
Siblings, even. In other words, if a sibling has an eating disorder, I've worked with people who the fact that a sibling has an eating disorder gets so covered up and hidden because it's impacting the rest of the children in the family.
There's a shame about it and a cover up about it, and a reality of I'm going to be matched at a different level, which creates a lot of anxiety. And then there's the whole other piece of, many of our clients, patients with eating disorders, may or may not have difficulty having children. There's a fertility issue. So the degree to which they have suffered or continue to suffer very much impacts the ideal of wanting to have, a full family of children, and makes them, again, less desirable.
How ironic it is that in order to be perfect, everyone's trying to be so perfect for their families, for the community, for marriage possibility, and some of that drive to be so perfect leads to eating disorders. So it's a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle, and I think that it's a really vicious cycle.
The other part of that is medication, which could actually, be part of an effective and successful treatment, is very much frowned upon. So that many patients either do go off medication or are very reluctant to go on medication, which makes the treatment sort of like climbing up a mountain without any spikes.
100%.
And makes it very difficult to get better. So we're caught in that spiral of, I can't expose what I need to do.
So I can't get the help that I need in order to get well, because if I get the help that I need, I'm going to be interfering with my success.
And imperfect, because the perfect way to get better from this perfect cycle is to not have medicine and to do it all on my own.
And to not need professional help and not need treatment.
Interestingly enough, as a nutrition therapist, I am more of a viable candidate for them to seek treatment with, because it's
Nutrition is
nutrition
not
is not
psychology.
psychology.
Right.
So they can come to me
Right.
and they can get some
Right.
kind of treatment. But of course, I always say, if you need 2 aspirins and you take 1, you're not going to get better.
That's right. That's right.
So
That's true.
I also think you picked up on a piece that is really not talked about, and this isn't a complete forum for it, but I just do want to make note of it, which is that you talked about this idea of fertility. In order to get pregnant, one has to be able to engage in their own sexuality. And sexuality and eating disorders are complicated as it relates to body, as it relates to being able to be in touch with yourself and being able to communicate with a spouse and, allow yourself so many important aspects of human sexuality and development that are very much intertwined with eating disorders. And so I think there's a whole conglomerate that comes with relationships and that are not impossible, but there's just something that has to be able to be on the table for discussion. And if information is withheld, then you can't
So
share
how
and
should
talk
it be
about
handled, do you think? Knowledge of an eating disorder, knowledge of a past eating disorder, knowledge of a current eating disorder that's being treated. How should this be
Rabbi, tell us, Rabbi.
in terms of shidduchim and what what do you do?
Right. Again, I always say I wear 2 hats, this one and also the therapy one. And sometimes they don't always work perfectly together. Usually the therapy one wins. But I think that we want to say share. But
Right.
at the same time, we don't actually want our clients to always share.
That's
We want
right.
them to be
Be
thoughtful
self-protective
and
sometimes.
self-protective sharers. And I think that is true for shidduchim also. I think, and I also think it speaks to the self-esteem piece, because if you label yourself, I am so-and-so and I have an eating disorder and date me. I mean,
That's not going to work either.
It doesn't
right.
work, and also it becomes so self-defeating for themselves. Their whole identity becomes this aspect that they're working to not integrate as who they are as a person. And so I actually think a little bit more of a thoughtful sharing is appropriate. And so I think one of the pieces I run up against, actually, though, is the fact that in the shidduch world, and as you move to the right, it becomes more extreme. There's this like constant pressure on the gas pedal. Like, we went out once, how do you feel? I don't know, it was just a cup of coffee. But you have to be able to identify at a certain juncture what's going on. And so I think sometimes it pushes people to share faster than they're able to actually get to know somebody. And so I do think that it's complicated, but I actually am an advocate that if you have to follow, we see divorce rates rising. We're talking about what's similar in the outside world, quote unquote, and in the inside world with the Orthodox community. Unfortunately, divorce is no different. And I think that part of that comes from just fast and slowing people down, communicating, sharing.
I think that's awesome. And I was thinking that while you were talking, that we really need to, there's this developmental urgency. And yet we know in the outside world and the inside world, people develop at different rates. There are 16-year-olds that are like 25-year-olds. There are 25-year-olds that are like 13-year-olds. And so the recognition that people need to go faster or slower or really, own their own pace, which I think is a little incongruous with the process, really needs to be, talked about a little bit more.
I think that's an important issue in the community.
That we allow the ones that are moving faster and on that pace to go on that pace.
And mothers and families will feel as though they're failing their children if their children are not on that fast track and moving along at the right age. The mother's busy trying to make the matches and trying to do her job to be a good mother. So she's failing. Then the daughter might feel worse about herself because she's failing her mother, or somebody in the family who has an eating disorder feels guilty because their siblings are being affected. And I've also seen that sometimes people will remain eating disordered or develop eating disorders because they themselves want to slow the process down and can't. You can't say that you want to slow the process down. I'm not ready to get married. You can't say that you're not ready to get married.
And not only that, they may have a younger sibling who's
right.
more ready than they
and
are.
And then
the pressure is
they
even
really
more.
feel worse about themselves because the younger siblings are getting married and they're getting matched.
So holding
and
on to
you're
the
failing
eating
even
disorder
more.
becomes a way
That's
for them
right.
to legitimately not have to be in the process.
And to
right.
cope.
So, we always used to say that the eating disorder serves a purpose.
Yes.
The idea is to help them understand and express and be able to talk about what they want, need, and feel without having to use the eating disorder. That's another big part of what I think needs to happen.
And again, we're talking about this idea of communicating that somebody doesn't feel like they fit the mold. This idea that something is not fitting for them in the way that they are supposed to, quote unquote, go through the trajectory of life. And they are being asked to push themselves into that mold. And I think in that struggle is where we see a manifestation of an eating disorder.
It becomes the voice of,
it's
I'm
the
in
voice
too much
of,
pain.
I don't know what to do.
Right.
Help me.
Yeah.
Help
Exactly.
me.
And it really requires, I'm thinking, real courage in families that are in the community that find themselves with an eating disorder child and really have to be able to stand up against some of the pressures and some of that which has always been defined as success, as a healthy, happy, good family, is the family that follows along in a certain trajectory. And it really requires courage to rise to meet the needs of
The
individual child and the individual family member, where it's just not fitting in and matching up exactly.
And I also think it creates a lot of mother-daughter strife. I hate to be that person that's like, mothers and eating disorders and creating chaos with their daughters. But I do think that one of the things in this, it is a stressful process. You watch these mothers, they now feel like they have to own this process. They're micromanaging their children's love lives in a way that is so foreign to most people. And part of that micromanagement has to do with perhaps a question about whether or not they're developmentally ready to be doing this process themselves. Some of it has to do with the system. But I think that one of the things that becomes hard is mothers have to be able to validate to their daughters they are amazing, and that the person who's going to marry them and the person who they're going to choose to marry is so lucky. And I think what happens in this anxiety process is that gets lost. And so what these girls feel is, what, I don't believe, we'll go back to self-esteem.
Right.
I don't believe in myself. I'm not good enough. Look how hard my mother's having to work to get me a date.
Something must be wrong with me.
Something must be wrong with me. How can I make myself more perfect?
That's right.
In order to win my mother's approval, my parents' approval, gain family reputation, and this whole intense cycle.
Which unfortunately fuels eating disorders.
Right, and the averse part of that is where the family blames if the child does not feel suited and matched to the people that she's being matched with, they blame the eating disorder for for you not being able to make the match. Like, this is a perfectly good guy, he's got everything that you want and need. Why isn't it okay for you? It must be your eating disorder that's getting in the way. So it goes in both directions.
It's really complicated.
It is really complicated. So how can families recognize eating disorders? And maybe that's something we can all address briefly, right? Because what do you do? How does a family know? How does a spouse know if a spouse is having an eating disorder? Men get eating disorders too, by the way. Boys and men, increasingly we know, and that number is rising, and we know about it more and more, that males get eating disorders. And also we know that people are getting eating disorders, not just young girls and teenagers are getting eating disorders. We know that older women have eating disorders. They've had them earlier, then they come out more in midlife. And sometimes women get eating disorders for the first time in midlife. So it's not just that we're talking about young girls. We're really talking about within a family system, can be any age and any person. So what do we do? How do we recognize it? Sandra.
The way I usually define it is the degree to which your thoughts and actions about food, weight, body image, and exercise interfere with the quality of your life, as opposed to being something that's beneficial. Take over the space in your mind and begin to take over your behaviors to the point at which they become isolating, socially distractive, mentally disturbing, and potentially, fatal. That's the degree that we're talking about an eating disorder. It is basically the way in which what you think and feel and tell yourself occupies all space and time, and there's no outside relationships, there's no outside creativity. The degree to which the field kind of gets very, very narrow, and that's all you can see. That's the degree that I think one is struggling. And if you see that happening in your child, in your spouse, if there's distraction and isolation and obsessionality where there's no presence of mind, that's the degree that one's struggling. And in this world, both the Jewish community and the secular community, we have disorder, and then we have eating disorder. It's a continuum. The degree to which that's happening is the degree to which it interferes with the quality of your life.
Right. I would agree with that completely in terms of just how you demarcate all those important pieces. I think that one of the ways that you can tell about whether or not somebody's quality of life has become so rigid and depleted and narrow is all about communication, and the importance of being connected to the people around us, and the ability to be sharing information with the people around us. If we're really in tune with what's going on with the people in our lives, by communicating, by asking questions, by sharing, by sitting around tables, whatever those tables look like.
And you watch the isolation sort of like take over.
Right. So being able to communicate,
being able to communicate
very,
and
very
share
important.
and realize when somebody's isolating and narrowing in. Wow, I haven't, that's so bizarre. I haven't spoken to my spouse.
And to not be in denial. And we all want to be in denial because denial feels better than to face a problem. So it's very important to communicate, to recognize when more and more isolation, when there's a problem. Also, a unique thing about eating disorders is that it is societal value taken to a problematic extreme. So a lot of things you'll see, my daughter's exercising every day. My wife, she goes to the gym every day. Boy, they're so thin. Everybody compliments how thin they are. You lose weight, you get so much positive feedback. You're a pure eater. You only eat organic. You're eating more and more natural and more clean and more healthy. Isn't that good? Now, you might think this is all positive. So how can families recognize when it begins to turn that corner where it's not so healthy? And that's always where it's become so preoccupying, where people's lives, they can't not exercise. It's not a matter of willpower in a good way. It's that they can't not have that willpower. They can't have the extra food. They can't not exercise. They can't, be flexible. They panic if there's going to be a meal out. There are holidays coming, and we can move into the question of holidays and food. But that creates panic in people because they have to figure out how to manage all of that challenge.
It moves from being a preference where this is something that I think is a good idea for me to a position. When I say,
and an identity.
Is this a preference that you have, or are you positioned? Can you do it the other way? What would happen if you did it the other way? So when that stuckness occurs, that's when we're really talking about the disorder. I have lots of preferences about how I eat and what I think is healthy, but I can certainly go the other way.
You can be flexible.
You can be flexible.
Right. So, it's about flexibility versus rigidity.
Is this a preference or a position? And most of the time when we're dealing with eating disorders, we get stronger and stronger and stronger in the positions.
Right.
And that becomes a stuckness as opposed to an ability to grow and change, which we're all doing throughout life. And if we can't do that, we are really stuck.
And it's why it's so isolating, because imagine if you couldn't be flexible, you can't go anywhere. You can't go and be around anything that potentially you can't control.
Right. Everything is predetermined.
You have to predetermine everything. Anything that might happen is too overwhelming. The might is overwhelming.
Right. The overwhelming
and food is part of natural life. A lot of societal, people come together, community, family, surrounds food.
Good natural life.
Right. So what about holidays, and how can that be addressed? Because it's very challenging.
I'm gonna say one line, and then I'm gonna switch it over to you, because this is totally your department. I hate this is like thick. Like, oh my goodness, the Sabbath meals, the holiday meals, Passover is coming up. And I think that one way to look at it is in a negative way. Oh my goodness, it's like, people talk about this idea in Judaism, it's feast or famine, Purim's coming up. First there's a fast day and then there's a feast.
Absolutely.
And this, juxtaposition between the restriction and the binging. But taking away, the complexities of this idea of fast days, which we know people who struggle with eating disorders should not be engaging in fast days, and there's lots, that's a totally different discussion. But in terms of this idea of feasting, I really like to think about it as feasting with family. It's a family opportunity, and it's coming together around the table to share and to enjoy, and all that encompasses, whether it's enjoying the food at the table and enjoying the company that you're with. I think we have to work really hard to think about what it means to sit at a table and not focus about the food and focus about the family. And that speaks to perfectionism. You hear everybody's worried, what are they making? What are they baking? but really
That's
trying to
absolutely
take
true.
a step
I think
back.
at the same time, though, we also have to realize that if someone in the family has having an eating
Yes.
disorder and struggling, we have to be sensitive.
100%.
Families have to learn how to be sensitive to the fact that, you know, it's very, very stressful
Yes.
for them to manage holiday food, to manage larger amounts of food, different foods, unique foods, restrictive foods. It is highly stressful, and that's something that families have to be sensitive to and to be able to address.
I was thinking when you were talking that the words were very nice, but it would be like saying to somebody who's
Yes.
petrified of snakes, just
Right.
sit at the table and enjoy it, you know, have a good time and
Right.
enjoy everybody there. And really what we're talking about is the degree to which the food
100%.
symbolically has become the entity of stress and overwhelm. And so
If you're trying
you
not
know,
to eat it,
you
or
know,
you're afraid that if
if-
you start eating, you're going to lose
if
control.
your fear, and again, it has to do with anxiety, it has to do with
100%.
overwhelm, it has to do with obsessive compulsiveness, it has to do with depression, it has to do with isolation. The food is just a symbol of it. And yet, this Sabbath day or holiday where you're asked to actually sit with the snake, not just for an hour and I can get away with it and we can
Right.
talk
Right.
about the tools and the skills that we've taught you and how do you take care of yourself and how do you, you know,
Right.
have conversation and what do you do for an hour. But after an hour, that wears a little thin and they really lose sight of themselves, and having to stay there for a long period of time becomes unraveling.
And the truth is that you're 100% right. You know, I'm speaking in a good world of an ideal and how we can think about it in terms of we're thinking about it and where we could try to go from a prevention perspective. That's what I'd like people to take. But if we're thinking about it from a treatment perspective and how can families help their children suffering, I think there's some really not easy tools, but some tools that people can employ. One thing to think about is how to shorten the meal.
First, they have to understand, like Eileen
Be
was saying,
sensitive
Be
to
the
sensitive.
level
Be
of
aware of.
anxiety
That's right, and how real
trauma
that
that
is.
is going
Yes.
on.
That's right.
What's the big deal? It's just food.
Mhm.
But this should be joyous. It should be a lot of things, but it's
Right.
not.
Right.
And
For
guests
this is a
at the
traumatic
table.
event. Every time I have to sit down, every Shabbos. So I have to do this on Shabbos, but then I have to compensate during the week. So there becomes a lot of different things that happen. So I just think they need to understand, the family needs to understand
100%.
the level of anxiety and trauma that comes along with that meal. And yes, then we need to work with both the family and our patients on how to minimize that and what we can do to ease that and what skills we can teach them and what ways we can teach the family and how much they have to be present for and not when they're going through their recovery and how recovered are they. You know, it's something similar to like if I was trying to abstain from drinking alcohol and I was sitting at the bar with everybody.
Right.
You know, I'm not,
Right.
you know, unfortunately we have to eat, so we have to be there.
And in the community, you know, Shabbos comes once a week, right? We have Shabbat every week. So it's not like, you know, Thanksgiving's once a year or whatever. Shabbat is every week. And then we have the holidays. So it
It is overwhelming, and I think on some level also it looms. In other words,
Right.
it looms at the beginning of the week. You've
That's
made
right.
it through. Let's
That's
talk
right.
about how it was.
That's right.
And now come Wednesday,
Uh-oh.
how do I prepare myself
Or you
for the
didn't make it
upcoming week?
through,
Or you
and you
didn't
have
make
to
it through,
regroup, and you
you're
regroup from
regrouping.
Monday to Friday, and then you know what's going to happen.
And I also think in terms of it's not just about Sabbath, it's also about a socialized piece. In other words, it's not just Sabbath and food, it's Sabbath and going to synagogue
Having guests
and
come,
seeing people
or-
and having guests come, and how do you negotiate out those values? You talk about family values, so it's a family value to have a lot of guests
Right.
over. So how do you balance out this idea of knowing what your family needs and at the same time balancing
Taking care of
out
yourself,
taking care
right.
of yourself, taking care of your family, taking care of guests? How much do you work the family around the person who's struggling with an eating disorder, but at the same time managing the sensitivity?
That's right.
And
And
so-
how do you preserve Shabbat, say, because you want it to be a beautiful family event for everyone, but you know you have a child or your mother or someone else is struggling and suffering, or a son? What do? How do you manage
balance.
everybody's needs? And one of the things that's important when you have a family member who has an eating disorder, it does impact the whole family. So one of the challenges to be able to preserve quality of life for the family system while also meeting the needs of the member who's struggling.
What is the balance?
That's
How
right.
much do you cater to the illness, and how much do you take care of the family? And that's a huge thing.
That's right. And either extreme is not
good
healthy.
for anybody,
It's
right.
not good for anybody to go too far either way. So that's where also getting help, getting treatment, people sometimes feel weak when they have to go get treatment and get help, but all the things that we're raising, the questions that we're addressing, really, the more help you can get, the better you can address it within your own family with the people that you love, and the more quickly recovery is possible.
I think that's really important, because sometimes it's thought of, my daughter has an eating disorder, she needs to go get help, and we don't need to go, we don't need to come, we don't need to work on this, but it's really important that the whole family understand and be a part of it.
And I think that, we could say, what do we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle, right? That was how we started. How do you handle the Sabbath meals? How do you handle the holidays? Well, we could come up with some suggestions, but the reality is that every family system is so complex, and the role that every child plays and the different needs, that it would be, I don't want to say disingenuous, but nearly impossible for us to come up with a solution or a guideline. And that's why I think the treatment is so important, is because it's about individualized treatment, understanding what works for your family, what works for your child, what your child's eating disorder about, or your eating disorder, whoever the you is in that scenario.
And what the cooking process is, and what the family value for the Shabbat meal is, and how many guests need to come or not come.
Right. Maybe there are real changes, and everybody has to know how flexible they can be, and how more flexible they need to be. And just thinking
one of the things also, it's very hard for families to understand that people who are struggling with eating disorder can't help it. It's not a choice. They're not choosing to be so difficult, or choosing to eat so carefully, or to give everybody such a problem. They can't help it. And that's where eating disorders really are disorders. They're psychological disorders, and they're not, because it may look like, come on, just eat. Why are you doing this to us? Families often feel that way. Look what you're doing to the family, which then people just feel worse and worse about themselves. It's not a choice. Recovery, getting help in order to be able to recover, that's where the choice is. But having an eating disorder, getting an eating disorder, your child getting an eating disorder, your loved one, it's not a choice. Not a choice.
And I think that relates to what you were talking about, Sandra, in terms of how do we identify what's an eating disorder. And I think that when a person can make a choice to do something different, then that speaks to where an eating disorder is in the spectrum. And I think it's important just to...
On the other hand, it certainly has to do with how people feel in terms of their lives getting more narrow and everything. But then there are also medical criteria and other criteria in terms of anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder. There are also specific criteria that pediatricians, doctors, internists, specialists, you want to always go to someone who knows eating disorders. Don't just go to someone who doesn't really know eating disorders, because you know how often I'll struggle to get a patient to an MD, and the doctor will say, "You're fine. Your weight is fine." I'll be like, "What do you mean your weight is fine?" The person I know is very, very sick. So finding specialty help is very, very important. And there are definite criteria. We don't have to figure out, is this person anorexic? Is it really a problem? We have medical criteria for all of these disorders in place.
Right. I was just thinking of, the cholesterol level going up in our severely anorexic patients, and going to a physician who doesn't really know that and says, "Oh, you have to cut out the fat in your diet." I'm like, are you kidding? It took me 4 months to get her to eat that butter.
That's right. That's right. And same thing with overeating. We've talked about anorexia, bulimia, but people who are binge eating disorder, and we now have it, it's a disorder. In the DSM-5, binge eating disorder, it's no longer compulsive eating, right? It's not, you have no willpower. What do you mean you can't stop eating? Why are you so losing control? Why are you so lazy? Why don't you exercise more? Whatever. People who have binge eating disorder can't help it, just like people who are anorexic can't help it. So
certain criteria and learning process, there are certain things that happen physiologically to the brain when the brain is starved that facilitate the disorder. There are certain things that happen to the brain when one doesn't eat all day and then eats all night that can be corrected through behavioral and psychological treatment. The treatment works. If people get treatment, they can get better. So that's an important piece. We're very hopeful that that's what comes out of this. It's that not that people can't get better, but that people need to get appropriate treatment from people who have skills and who have learned how to treat eating disorders over the years.
Just to comment also to the binge eating, with the sheer number of people who are having medical interventions to help with weight loss, I think is an important piece just to throw in there. We did spend a lot of time talking about anorexia and bulimia, but the complications of people with histories of eating disorders and obesity being on that spectrum as well, and then having surgical interventions and not necessarily addressing them with psychological treatment, appropriate nutritional treatment, and then struggling at tables, engaging in a lot of disordered eating, the medical complications that can follow through. And so just kind of opening up and widening our thought process about what it means to have normalized eating, going to the table hungry, walking away food full, that normalized, moderate pattern, I think is just something to just keep somewhere in our heads in the discussion.
And that eating is emotional and behavioral and physiological. And if they don't really deal with the emotional part of it, they can have whatever surgery you want. But
superficial fixes don't cure eating disorders.
You have to get to the underlying piece of how food is being used, or the opposite side of the coin, not used, to anesthetize or distract.
What are the emotional issues underlying these disorders? And that's part of where treatment comes in. And people don't get better without treatment, or they get better for a while and then it comes back again. So, but again, people can get better, but you can't ignore it or hope that, I'll have some liposuction, or I'll, have some surgery, or I'll, and then everything will be okay, because you've got to get to some of the underlying issues. Otherwise, people don't just magically recover. Even though, as hard as they may want to, as much as they're trying, you can't get better just like that. It's more complicated. Anything that we didn't address that you would like to before? I want to talk about help and resources at the end. But Sarah, anything that we didn't address that you wanted to?
I feel like we covered a lot of really important topics. We touched on a lot of different things, all things that are really important.
And hopefully this is the beginning also of more and more discussion about all the specifics, because there were a lot of specific questions that I had here on the list that we didn't get to address. But again, hopefully this is the beginning of increasing discussion.
I think the good news now, and hopefully you're going to talk about this, is that here we are, out of the infancy in a place where there's more and more available treatment in general, and specifically for the Orthodox community. There are treatment centers and therapists and nutritionists who really understand the Orthodox community and are able to specialize and tailor the wants and needs. So I think treatment is available, which wasn't available when we first started in this field.
That's true.
In many different kind of ways. So you can.
That's true. And I know I've had over the years many people who will come out of their community and come see me in a faraway location because they don't want anybody to know that they're going for help and that they're seeing a specialist. And that's okay. I just want them to be able to get help. Hopefully more and more people won't be so ashamed, and there can be help in their community, in Brooklyn, in different areas of where people live, that it won't be that they have to go hide and hope they don't run into anybody and sneak in order to get help.
And you're doing training to make that happen, right?
Right,
You're
absolutely.
And training, so there's a lot more available these days.
That's what we're trying to do. So help is available, recovery is possible. Where should people turn to for help if they, a loved one, someone is struggling? And there are resources within the community. There are resources in schools. There are resources in synagogues. Talk to your rabbi. Talk to people that you respect. Talk to the rebbetzin. Talk to people in the community to try to get help. Talk to your pediatrician, talk to your doctor, talk to your internist. And you know what? If you don't get the serious response that you need, then go talk to someone else. Keep talking to who you need to talk to in order to get the help until someone takes you seriously and can direct you to the help. NEDA, the National Eating Disorders Association, Sandra and I are founders of NEDA, so NEDA is an amazing organization. We've watched it to grow and bloom, and there is so much help available at NEDA. We have a helpline, 1-800-931-2237, 1-800-931-2237. You can always call the helpline. It's confidential, and you can call and you can ask for any help that you want. Therapists, nutritionists, dietitians. The NEDA Navigators program NEDA offers, and that matches up people who can work with non-professionals, but people who have been through eating disorders themselves, somehow been affected by an eating disorder themselves or within their family, and you can have a navigator. There's no charge for this program, and we're happy to hook people up with navigators. So that's important. You can, again, through the NEDA helpline or the NEDA office, you can get that information. And there's lots of educational resources. We're going to be, NEDA's doing a ton for Eating Disorders Awareness Week, but in general, all year long, Eating Disorders Awareness Week is the last week in February, but all year long, NEDA is always there. It's available for you. There's Click to Chat. There's Proud to Be Me for younger people. There are so many resources, so please reach out. We really want to help everyone get the help they need in order to get healthy and find recovery. Thank you all.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.